when you look at, that massive tangled ball of cables behind your television.
Oh, yeah. The worst.
Right. It's just this chaotic knot of power cords and HDMI cables, Ethernet wires. And your first instinct is usually just to, sigh and look away.
Yeah, you just pretend it's not there.
Exactly. Because you pull one cord to, I don't know, fix the sound, and suddenly the Wi-Fi drops. Or the screen just goes completely black.
The sheer density of it is just intimidating.
It really is. And honestly, for a lot of us, that is exactly how it feels when we try to look at global geopolitics, specifically, in the Middle East.
Oh, absolutely.
You see a headline about, say, a shipping lane being blocked, and suddenly 3 completely different countries are severing diplomatic ties. And it just feels like this unsolvable knot.
Right. It's arguably one of the most, pervasive topics in global news, yet it consistently leaves people feeling just overwhelmed.
Yeah, completely overwhelmed.
We often assume that because the conflicts are so persistent, they must be driven by some, irrational, random animosity.
Like they just hate each other for no reason.
Exactly. But when you look closely at the underlying mechanics, it actually follows a very clear, albeit, highly complex logic.
Which is exactly why we are doing this today. We have a massive stack of sources on the table for this deep dive.
A really big stack today.
Yeah. We've got geopolitical risk assessments, demographic studies from the region, historical analyses of post-World War I treaties, and just a pile of foreign policy journals.
Oh, good stuff.
And we are going to take all of this research and unpack the complexities step by step. I do want to say, though, our goal today isn't to judge.
Right. Absolutely not.
We aren't here to promote any side of any conflict. We're simply here to help you, the listener, understand the why behind the headlines.
And to do that, we are going to look at the region through 3 foundational pillars.
Okay.
By breaking the region down into these 3 concepts, the overwhelming complexity kind of shifts into a framework we can actually analyze.
Well, let's jump right into it then. What is the very first pillar we need to understand?
So the first pillar is what we'll call the monolith myth.
The monolith myth, okay.
Yeah. The biggest roadblock to understanding the Middle East is actually the very language used in daily news broadcasts.
Like how so?
Well, we hear phrases like, the Middle East reacted today, which implies this unified, monolithic block.
Right. Like they all got together in a room and voted.
Exactly. Now, anyone who follows global news knows the Middle East is made up of multiple countries.
Sure.
But the nuance we often miss is the profound depth of the ethno-linguistic and, religious divides that define how these countries operate.
Okay, so it's not just borders.
No, it's way deeper. We're looking at 4 massive, totally distinct cultural spheres sharing the same geographic space.
And those are?
You have the Arab world, the Persian sphere in Iran, the Turkish sphere, and then the Kurdish population, which is spread across several borders.
So treating the Middle East as one single monolithic culture is kind of like walking into a massive, incredibly diverse neighborhood, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
And just assuming every single household speaks the exact same language, eats the same food, and follows the same rules just because they share a zip code.
Precisely.
The news headlines lump the region together because, it's fast. And it fits perfectly in a push notification.
Yeah, it's shorthand.
But it creates this false impression of total uniformity.
It does. And, taking that neighborhood analogy further, imagine the friction if those completely different houses were forced to share a single community council.
Oh, man, it would be a nightmare.
Right. When we look at those 4 spheres, the Arab, Persian, Turkish, and Kurdish spheres, they aren't just speaking different languages. They're drawing on entirely different cultural touchstones past empires.
Wow.
And then you layer religion on top of that.
Right, which complicates it even more.
Definitely. We frequently hear about the Sunni and Shia divide within Islam, but our sources really emphasize that this isn't just, a theological disagreement about religious texts.
It's more than that.
Much more. It is a massive geopolitical fault line. It dictates alliances, funding, and proxy dynamics across the whole board.
Let's ground this in a specific example from the research, because Lebanon frequently pops up in these foreign policy journals as a prime example of this demographic complexity.
Oh, Lebanon is a fascinating case study.
Yeah, it's a country roughly the size of Connecticut, but its internal political structure is completely defined by this diversity, isn't it?
It is. Lebanon's confessional system, which was solidified by the TAIF agreement, is a perfect illustration.
Okay, break that down for us.
So, by law, The president of Lebanon must be a Maronite Christian.
Really? By law?
By law. And the prime minister has to be a Sunni Muslim.
Okay.
And the speaker of parliament must be a Shia Muslim.
Wow, so political power is literally mathematically divided among the sects.
Exactly. And the whole point of that was to prevent a civil war. So when an outside event happens, Lebanon doesn't react as a single unified entity.
Because it can't.
Right. Its reaction is a highly calibrated, super fragile balancing act between these internal groups. And each of those groups has completely different external allies.
But let me push back on this a little bit.
Yeah.
Like, how much does this cultural and linguistic divide really matter in modern realpolitik?
It matters a lot.
I mean, obviously, language and religion are important, but don't state actors ultimately just make pragmatic, calculated decisions for power and money?
Well, yes and no.
So why are distinct languages and cultural spheres the necessary, first step to understanding the geopolitical board?
Because culture and language are the primary vehicles for soft power and regional influence.
Okay.
Take Iran, for example. Iran is Persian and predominantly Shia. They cannot easily project soft power into a country that is entirely Arab and Sunni just by throwing money at them.
Because the cultural barrier is too high.
Exactly. They have to find demographic overlaps, like supporting Shia minority groups in other nations to build their sphere of influence.
I see.
And Saudi Arabia, as a major Sunni Arab power, does the exact same thing through different channels.
Right, playing to their own cultural ties.
Right. So when you assume they are a monolith, you're just blind to the actual chessboard they are playing on. You miss how they leverage these cultural ties to build competing power blocks.
That makes total sense. By stripping away the uniqueness of these different nations and demographic groups, we're basically blinding ourselves to the actual dynamics on the ground.
Exactly.
We expect them to act like one unified region, and when they don't, we just label it as chaos.
But it isn't random chaos.
Right.
It's the natural friction of distinct, fully formed cultural spheres competing for security and influence in a shared, highly volatile space.
Which brings us to our second pillar perfectly.
Let's hear it.
Once we recognize that this region is a patchwork of distinct cultural spheres and nations, the natural next question is, well, how did these borders get drawn in the first place?
Right.
And how does that specific history dictate today's headlines?
Mm.
You call this second pillar the long shadow of the past.
Yes. Because history in the Middle East is not treated the way it often is in the West, like just a series of dates locked away in a textbook.
Right, something you memorize for a test and forget.
Exactly. Over there, past events actively and continuously affect modern realities. Our research stack points heavily to the aftermath of World War I as the blueprint for modern tensions.
So, the fall of the empire.
Right. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed, British and French diplomats literally took a map and a ruler and carved up the region to suit their own empires.
You were talking about the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916.
I am. Sir Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot drew these arbitrary lines in the sand.
Literally in the sand.
Literally. And they created borders that bundled rival ethnic groups into single, newly invented countries.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Oh, it was. Because simultaneously, they were splitting unified ethnic groups across multiple new borders.
Think of it like a family dinner table, right?
Okay, I like this.
Imagine there was this massive argument 10 years ago where someone got disinherited or, a huge promise was broken.
A deep betrayal.
Right.
Oh,
and
God.
Today, someone simply asks to pass the salt, and suddenly everyone is just screaming at each other.
Over salt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To an outsider, it makes no sense to fight over salt. But the family isn't fighting over salt. That past event is completely dictating how everyone interacts today.
That is a perfect analogy, and applying that dynamic to the post-World War I borders gives us so much clarity on, say, the Kurdish situation today.
Oh, absolutely. Walk us through that.
Well, the Kurds are an ethnic group of roughly 30 to 40 million people. They have their own distinct language and culture.
Huge population.
Massive. But because of the way those European lines were drawn, they were left without a state of their own.
Just completely carved out.
Yeah. Today, the Kurdish population is fractured across the borders of Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran.
So when we read a headline today about Turkey launching military operations across the border into northern Syria or Iraq, it looked to a casual observer like a sudden, aggressive territorial grab, right?
Right, like a modern dispute over land.
But It's actually the direct fallout of a 100-year-old treaty that split a demographic group across heavily militarized borders.
The border itself is the grievance.
Yeah.
And it's not just Sykes-Picot either.
Like else.
Look at the historical claims that led to the Gulf War.
Okay, 1990.
Yeah, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990 wasn't just some random act of aggression. It was heavily fueled by Iraq's historical argument that Kuwait was artificially separated from Iraqi territory by British colonial administrators decades earlier.
Wow.
The shadow of the past literally drives the tanks of the present.
I want to challenge this deterministic view of history, though.
Sure, go ahead.
If every single modern issue is deeply rooted in centuries of complex history and, colonial map-making, how do you explain sudden shifts in diplomacy?
Like what?
Well, for example, the Abraham Accords. We saw several Arab nations normalize ties with Israel despite decades of historical conflict. Or recently, we saw China broker a détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran, who have been bitter rivals for decades.
Also true.
So if history dictates everything, how do these highly pragmatic, very modern agreements even happen?
That is a crucial distinction to make. Recognizing the weight of history does not mean the region is incapable of pragmatic diplomacy.
Okay.
Nations will always make tactical pivots to secure their immediate economic or security interests.
Survival instincts.
Exactly. The Saudi-Iran détente, for instance, was heavily driven by a mutual desire for economic stability and a mutual need to, de-escalate costly proxy conflicts.
Makes sense.
However, these diplomatic agreements are often tactical pauses rather than the total erasure of historical animosity.
So it's a ceasefire, not a memory wipe.
Exactly. It's not a memory wipe.
Yeah.
The historical mistrust remains the baseline operating system. When you see a conflict flare up, or even when you see a sudden peace treaty signed, you have to read it through the lens of that historical context.
So you don't need a PhD in ancient history to follow the news.
No, definitely not. But you must acknowledge that you cannot separate today's diplomatic maneuvers from Yes.
Because these various countries have incredibly diverse cultures, and they have these deeply entrenched historical grievances that inevitably means they're going to want entirely different things for their futures.
That's right.
We call this third pillar the web of goals. We have to look at competing national interests.
And a nation's interest is whatever it believes it absolutely needs to survive and thrive.
Sure.
And in the Middle East, the geography makes those interests incredibly competitive. The research highlights two main drivers of this competition:
Which are?
geographic choke points and shared natural resources.
Let's talk about the geography first, because it is staggering how much global leverage is concentrated in such a really small area.
It really is. We are talking about places like the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait.
Right.
The Strait of Hormuz is a waterway between Oman and Iran that connects the Persian Gulf to the open ocean.
And it's tiny, right?
Very small. At its narrowest point, the shipping lanes are only about 2 miles wide in each direction.
2 miles?
Yeah. Yet roughly 20 to 30% of the world's oil consumption passes through that tiny bottleneck.
That is insane. So Iran's national interest naturally involves maintaining leverage over that strait as like a defense mechanism and a bargaining chip against global sanctions.
Exactly.
But meanwhile, the national interest of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Western nations is keeping that exact same strait completely open and unthreatened.
Right.
They both want security, but their definitions of security are completely incompatible just based on the map.
That's exactly it. And we see this play out with resources, too.
Like oil.
Oil, yes, but also water. Water is a prime example.
Yeah.
The Tigris and Euphrates rivers are the lifeblood of the region. They originate in Turkey, they flow through Syria, and they empty out through Iraq.
Okay, so 3 countries sharing one water source.
Yes. And Turkey has spent decades developing the Southeastern Anatolia Project, or GAP, building massive dams to generate hydroelectric power and irrigate their own agriculture.
Well, that's Turkey's national interest right there. Energy independence and economic growth.
Exactly.
But water is a finite resource.
Highly finite.
If Turkey dams the river upstream, the water flow downstream into Syria and Iraq is drastically reduced. It's honestly exactly like living with multiple roommates.
Oh, here we go. Back to the roommates.
Well, think about it. Let's say you have an apartment with 3 people and a single hot water tank.
Okay.
Roommate number 1, Turkey, decides they need to run the dishwasher and the washing machine simultaneously every morning because they have a busy work schedule.
Very productive roommate.
Right. But roommate number 2, Syria, is in the shower and suddenly gets blasted with freezing cold water.
That simple cause and effect friction is at the very root of what is so often mislabeled on the global stage as a single, unsolvable Middle East problem.
It's not malice.
No. Turkey isn't damming the river purely out of malice towards Syria or Iraq. They're just fulfilling their own domestic energy policies.
Right.
But the geographic reality means their domestic policy creates a national security crisis for their neighbors, who rely on that water for their own agriculture and survival.
Let me play devil's advocate here, though.
Sure.
Doesn't peace ultimately bring more economic prosperity than conflict?
You would think so.
I mean, if Turkey, Syria, and Iraq cooperated fully on water sharing, or, say, if the nations bordering the eastern Mediterranean cooperated on extracting the massive natural gas reserves found off the coast of Cyprus, wouldn't everyone get richer?
Technically, yes.
So why does the pursuit of national interests so often default to zero-sum conflict rather than profitable cooperation?
Well, you are assuming that economic profit is always the highest priority for a state.
Is it not?
In the West, we often view geopolitics through an economic lens, The whole idea that trade prevents war.
Right. If our economies are tied, we won't fight.
Exactly. But in the Middle East, regime survival and national security almost always override immediate economic profit.
Really?
Yes. If a country feels structurally vulnerable, maybe because of those arbitrary borders from Pillar 2, or the demographic sectarian divides from Pillar 1, they will prioritize control and leverage over joint economic ventures.
So if cooperating on a natural gas pipeline makes a country richer but gives a historical rival the ability to, say, turn off their power grid in the future, they will choose to block the pipeline.
Every single time. Security trumps prosperity when trust is historically absent.
Wow.
When you look at the Eastern Mediterranean gas fields, you don't just see a business negotiation. You see Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, Lebanon, Israel, and Egypt all trying to claim maritime borders.
That's a lot of cooks in the kitchen.
And those maritime borders overlap. Every country is just trying to secure their own energy future, but doing so requires drawing a line in the water that directly invalidates their neighbor's claim.
Man, when you pull all three of these pillars together, the picture becomes incredibly clear.
It really does.
You have the first pillar, distinct cultural, linguistic, and religious spheres, Arab, Persian, Turkish, and Kurdish, operating with completely different worldviews.
And then you add the second pillar, a living history where arbitrary colonial borders and past betrayals are actively dictating modern trust levels.
And finally, the third pillar, a web of competing goals where these diverse, historically burdened nations are forced to fight over finite geographic choke points and shared resources like rivers and maritime borders.
When you view the region through this framework, the tangled knot of cables starts to untangle.
You stop seeing a monolith of senseless random conflict.
Exactly. You see a highly complex system of cause and effect. Every action, whether it's a dam being built, a shipping lane being harassed, or a surprising diplomatic treaty being signed, is a calculated move within this three-pillar framework.
And the main takeaway for you, listening right now, is that while this makes the region undeniably complex, the complexity shouldn't be intimidating.
No, not at all.
By taking it step by step, recognizing the diversity, respecting the weight of the history, and identifying the underlying pragmatic interests, you can build a balanced understanding.
Absolutely.
You don't need to get bogged down by every obscure political acronym, and most importantly, you don't need to feel the pressure to take a side. You can simply be an informed observer, understanding the mechanics of the friction.
Shifting the paradigm from, this is too hard to understand to this is a fascinating web of human interaction and state survival changes everything.
It totally flips the script.
When you understand the why behind the actions, the what on the evening news becomes much more legible.
Which brings us to our challenge for you today. We always like to leave you with something actionable to put this deep dive into practice.
What's the mission today?
We want you to take one small action today. Just choose one single country in the Middle East and spend 5 minutes looking into its internal makeup.
I love that.
Look up its demographic breakdown. How many different languages are spoken within its borders? What is a major historical event that happened there before World War I? Take one country out of the monolith and see it as a distinct, unique place with its own internal complexity.
And as you do that, consider this final thought.
Yeah.
We've spent this time exploring how a broad label like the Middle East masks profound diversity, fragile borders, and complex human motivations.
So much gets hidden under that label.
Right. So if that massive label is hiding so much detail, what other broad geographic or cultural labels are you unconsciously simplifying in your own mind?
Ooh, that's a good question.
When we rely on shorthand terms for entire continents or massive groups of people, do we risk losing sight of the actual individual human beings and the intricate histories that shape their lives?
It makes you wonder how many other tangled balls of cables we've been staring at, assuming they were just one single wire. Until next time, keep unpacking those complexities.